Good evening and welcome to this panel of the Carnegie Endowment's Beirut Center yearly conference. I'm Kim Ghattas. I'll be moderating this conversation. If you're tuning in from the Middle East, good evening. If you're tuning in from the US, good morning. The hashtag for the conference and for this conversation is CMEC 2021. I'm looking forward to this conversation with some great speakers about the regional players that are in this region over the last few years, whether partners of the US like Turkey and the UAE, or foes of the US like Iran. They have increasingly carved out space for themselves to pursue aggressively sometimes their foreign policy interests through proxies or directly. From Libya to Yemen to Lebanon, they compete, they overlap, but they also increasingly set the agenda. The region that President-elect Biden is inheriting from President Trump is even more complicated than the one that President Obama left behind. We're going to take a look at where things stand today, explore the regional dynamics between these different players, what drives them, and then look at what policy options there are for the incoming Biden administration. As I said, we've got some great speakers. I'll start with Kristin Diwan from the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. We have Karim Sadjadpour with Carnegie in DC. Also in DC at Carnegie is Aaron David Miller. Joining us from Pretoria is actually Sinan Ülgen, who covers Turkey. He's with Carnegie Europe. And in Beirut, at the Carnegie Center in Beirut, we have Ahmed Nagi. Again, the hashtag for this conference and this conversation is CMEC 2021. Now, I want to start by looking at what the region looks like today, after 4 years of Trump. We'll have a conversation with the panelists for about 15 minutes or so. This is a longer panel than the other ones because we've got so many excellent speakers. And then we'll have time for questions towards the end from the audience for about half an hour or 40 minutes. You can send your questions through the comment box and I'll get to them once we've had a bit of a conversation with the panelists. But I want to start with looking at the region as it is today, after 4 years of the Trump administration. And Sinan, I want to start with you because this is where the news is. I mean, there's always a lot of news in the region, but today the news is very much focused on Turkey and these American sanctions on Turkey. Tell us a little bit what got us here and what you make of those sanctions and this move by the Trump administration in its last few days.
Well, I mean, it was inevitable that would end up here. Given that this is based on Turkey's decision to purchase a Russian air and defense missile system, the S-400, which has triggered these sanctions, the Ghattas sanctions against Turkey. For long, actually, President Trump used his presidential prerogatives to postpone what was inevitable. And he was criticized for it also by Congress, but ultimately he was compelled to essentially adopt these measures, given that there was a clause in the National Defense Authorization Act that was just voted in Congress, which compels the administration to impose these sanctions within 30 days. Maybe it is a blessing in disguise for the Biden administration, because this will not be a measure that they will have to take as they enter office. I think that they have more an interest in trying to see whether a more positive dialogue and engagement with Turkey can be structured. And therefore, the fact that they don't have to do this in their first initial days in office might actually be beneficial. And so perhaps the reaction of the Turkish government, because that reaction has been relatively muted, signaling a more wait-and-see approach and basically waiting for the Biden administration to walk in and essentially try to see whether this type of new arrangement, a new agreement, can be reached with the Biden administration. So that's where we are today.
And Sinan, just to follow up a little bit, I mean, tell us more about the relationship between President Trump and Turkey and Erdogan specifically, and how it unfolded over the last 4 years. A lot, and we'll get to that with the other speakers as well, a lot was based on personal relationships for President Trump. How did that feed President Erdogan's regional policies?
Well, it was an odd relationship because it was a highly personal one, and basically it allowed Turkey to either get U.S. backing or at least get U.S. neutrality with a phone call to President Trump. That's exactly what happened. With for instance, after the Erdogan's phone call to Trump, the U.S. president deciding to walk out of Syria, and so that was this relationship in that sense that Erdogan had with Trump allowed Turkey to operate in a way that may not have been possible if we had, a more stable administration, where institutions matter or matter more than what they mattered during the Trump era. And I think the new phase is going to be exactly that, this Turkey's relationship with the United States that was so much encapsulated in this personal relationship between the two leaders will need to change. And it will change in the direction that will need to take into consideration the new reality in Washington, which is not only a new administration, but also an administration where the stakeholders are more diverse. And this is a lesson that I think has to be drawn not only by Turkey, but also for all the other countries that in the past, built their relationship with the United States based on their personal connection to the U.S. president.
And indeed, that takes me to Aaron and Kristin, because when it comes to the Gulf and when it comes to Israel, a lot of what the Trump administration did and tried to do and achieved was based on a lot of these personal relationships. Aaron, I'll start with you. Israel got a lot done under President Trump that it wanted to see done, whether it's the moving of the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, various other moves as well. Did they get more than under any other American president? How will they see the outgoing Trump administration?
I mean, there's no question, having watched the U.S.-Israeli relationship for over 40 years and having played a role in helping to shape it for 25, there's no precedent for this. And it was driven largely, had this been tethered or anchored to the national interest or a defensible case that could be made that this was, in fact, in American national interests, my reaction would be somehow different, but it really wasn't. You had a president who has tethered his foreign policy, not just on the issue of Israel, but on many foreign policy issues toward his domestic political agenda, his own personal vanities, and his own sensibilities. The other, I think, North Star that guided his policy was his desire to be the un-Obama. And I think he was so persuaded, for any number of reasons, A, it didn't make good politics, that the JCPOA and the way the Biden administration had dealt with the Israelis needed to be fundamentally altered. And that was also true with the companion policies that he followed toward Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's unprecedented in the history of the presidency, the modern presidency, that any American president would take his first foreign trip, very first one, not to Canada, not to Mexico, not to Britain, not to see the NATO allies, but to visit Saudi Arabia and Israel. It's extraordinary, and it should have been a sort of a blinking light to all of us that this president was fundamentally going to change not just the tone of relationships with, including the Emiratis, Israel and the Saudis, but the substance. I remember having a conversation with Mr. Kushner in 2017 in which he said that his father-in-law was going to make it unmistakably clear that they were going to develop strategic, quote unquote, strategic relationships with the Saudis and the Israelis. And he was going to make it impossible for any Israeli prime minister to say no to his father-in-law. And I think that's essentially what you've seen 4 years later. And yes, I think the Israelis who applauded Donald Trump, not just Benjamin Netanyahu, he was clearly the most popular American president in any country in the world. I think the Israelis are going to be hearing a different sort of tone and some different kind of music beginning in January. However, I don't think it's going to be transformative. We're not going to see the pendulum swing now to the opposite impact. Donald Trump gave Israel all the honey. You're not going to see clearly Joe Biden begin to give the Israelis only vinegar.
We'll get to that in some more detail later in the conversation. I want to draw you out a little bit on that. But Kristin, picking up on what something that Aaron just said, the most popular president in Israel, the most popular American president in Israel ever. Was Trump the most popular American president in the Gulf as well? It certainly looked like it as well. A lot was based on these personal relationships that President Trump had or thought he had with leaders of Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince, but also with the Emiratis. How much more room for maneuver did that give leaders in the Gulf? I know the answer, but we want to hear it from you.
Yeah, well, certainly. I mean, in some quarters of the Gulf, that's certainly the case. That Trump was an extremely popular president. But I think there's a bit of a paradox when we look at that. I mean, you could definitely argue, and I think Aaron's already made the case that Naumann administration worked harder to build these kind of close and personalistic ties, and the first visit going to Saudi Arabia is certainly a huge indication of that. Yet you could also see that over those same 4 years of the Trump administration, I mean, the Gulf states simultaneously have been working really hard to diversify their economic and strategic ties. And I think those same Gulf states have done a lot to usher us into this kind of age of greater multipolarity that we see, I mean, across the whole Middle East region right now. And I think when we try to understand that, why is that the case? On the one hand, we can see a case of sort of relative strength coming from the Gulf states, that when they looked out across this region and saw just all these incidents of, civil war or civil unrest and economic weakness, they sensed an opportunity to really expand their influence. In some cases, they felt even an imperative to intervene, to shape the region in a way that serves their interests. And definitely when you look at a state like the UAE, that's the case. We see really expanded ambition. I mean, we can look all the way, in fact, into the Red Sea and the Mediterranean for what the Emiratis have been doing over the past 4 years. But at the same hand, I mean, you've got this idea of a strength, but there's also this weakness, this inherent kind of vulnerability that's there too. Because even with this embrace that the Trump administration did for its Saudi and Emirati partners, we still had in 2019 this drone attack on the Abqaiq oil facilities in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. That's quite a signal. I mean, when Iran can be that effective in an attack, and the U.S. basically was unable to prevent it, or their partnership with the U.S. didn't prevent that. So I think and this was like this key issue, right? This is the issue that the U.S. is supposed to be most interested in, the stability on this free flow of oil.
Yeah, and I want to jump in there, Kristin, because you bring up Iran. I want to go to Karim, in fact, and get into a sort of a situation rep of where we are today with Iran. Like Kristin said, President Trump was really there for his friends in the Gulf, and yet you had this attack against Abqaiq. You have regular missile being launched from Yemen into Saudi Arabia. And you have the sense in this region that Iran is still quite powerful through its proxy militias from Iraq to Lebanon to Syria and to some extent with the Houthis in Yemen. What did President Trump achieve when it comes to his maximum pressure on Iran? And building on that, is it a fair assessment to say that Iran remains powerful and successful in its policies, whether we agree with them or not, or is it just an impression that it is able to give of its continued power or influence?
Thank you so much for the questions, Kim. It's great to be with all of you. I think broadly speaking, President Trump's policy vis-a-vis Iran was essentially to subject Iran to so much sanctions pressure that it would force one of two outcomes, either the capitulation of the Iranian regime, the nuclear capitulation of the Iranian regime, or its collapse. So given that the regime hasn't walked back its nuclear program, in fact, its nuclear program has increased 12-fold from the time that Trump pulled out of the deal, and the fact that the regime, despite the fact that its economy has been debilitated, it's arguably more powerful and certainly more united than it was at the outset of Trump's term. The Trump policy, by its own metrics, has been unsuccessful. I think what makes Iran effective in the region is the fact that more than any other actor in the Middle East, it's able to fill power vacuums. So where are the places where Iran has most influence? It's Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen. 4 countries which are very embattled. They're either in the midst of civil war or they're failed or failing states. So Iran is better than anyone in the Middle East at filling those power vacuums. And the reason why they're better is that they're really the best in the nation, best among nation states in the Middle East at harnessing militias and radicals. And I think the advantage Iran has over all of its Sunni rivals is the fact that virtually all Shiite radicals are willing to go out there and fight and kill, if not die, for Iran. But virtually all Sunni radicals like ISIS and Al-Qaeda are opposed to the nation states in the Middle East, whether that's Saudi Arabia, Turkey, or others.
Karim, are we saying here that maximum pressure was a failure and Iran is more powerful and influential today in the Middle East than 4 years ago?
I think maximum pressure, by its own metrics of trying to get the regime to either compromise on its nuclear program or bring down the government, has failed on those metrics. With regards to Iran's role in the Middle East, I can't tell you whether it's significantly. It seems to me that it's as influential in the region as it was when Trump began office. Now, the assassination of Qasem Soleimani was a major blow. It was their top military commander in the region, and I think that it was more of a blow to people, to the regime than people know. But I guess broadly speaking, what I'd say, Kim, is if you look over the course of the last 12 years, take the last 12 years as a case study of what has worked and what hasn't worked vis-a-vis Iran, we saw that in President Obama's first term, it was essentially a policy of mostly engagement, not much pressure, and it wrought no results. We saw Trump's first term was the opposite. It was virtually all pressure, very little engagement, no tangible results. The only time we've seen tangible results was President Obama's second term, when it was this combination of both significant multilateral pressure and sustained US diplomacy that the JCPOA was born. So I think that general formula of pretty significant pressure coupled with rigorous engagement in US diplomacy is the only formula that has really produced any tangible results.
Okay, we'll get back to this point later on in the conversation, because I actually think, and I will ask you that later, leave that thought there, that what really worked was the first Obama administration, where it was a combination of sanctions and pressure and engagement, which led to the negotiations. And then in the second Obama administration, it was all negotiations, and there's a sense in the region that there was no pressure anymore and Iran's influence expanded. But we can debate that in a bit. I want to go first to Ahmed and draw him in on this conversation about Yemen. This is a conflict that has been going on for 5 years now. It's absolutely devastating, the toll that it has taken on the country and its people. A Saudi-led war with US support and British support, which has been mostly or very often forgotten in the world headlines, and it should not be forgotten, because conflicts that have such a devastating toll must be constantly remembered as we all try to bring light to it and hope that somewhere a solution is being found. But Ahmed, I want to ask you to remind our viewers, our audience, who may not know where things stand precisely because Yemen doesn't make enough headlines. Where are we today? What is the situation on the ground as far as you can tell? And what are the different players thinking about how you end this conflict today? And we'll get later on into what the Biden administration can do.
Thank you so much, Kim. If we look today at the situation in Yemen, actually it's a devastating situation where every single part of the country is impacting from the conflict consequences. Today, Yemen is this is according to the UN reports, the largest human-made humanitarian crisis, where we have almost, so many humanitarian issues, including poverty, starvation, famine, among so many diseases as well. And the problem is that as long as the conflict continues, new crises coming out on daily basis. And I think over the last 5 years, the transformation and dynamics of conflicts are affecting the local communities even more. Today, we have not just one conflict, actually, it's a series of conflicts. Usually people say that, what's happening in Yemen is a conflict between Iran and Saudis, and they are fighting each other through their proxies. But if we go deeply inside Yemen, we can find so many conflicts within this big war. And over the past 5 years, there's so many fragmentation and divisions among the big fronts that we're talking about at the beginning of conflict in 2015. So today we have a government in Sana'a, which is controlled by the Houthis, which is the de facto government. And we have a government in Eden, which is controlled by the Southern Transitional Council, which is sponsored by the United Arab Emirates. And on the other side of the country, we have so many local governments, which are nominally under the control of the Hadi government. But again, the upper hand inside the country, it's in the hands of the regional actors, namely Saudi Arabia and Emiratis, and on the other side, with the Houthis, we have Iran. So talking about such kind of situation, it's difficult to resolve it, and day by day, the peace or bringing peace to the country seems elusive. And speaking about, Trump administration, I think Yemen was not a priority for them. It was just, secondary matter, and they look at it just from security perspective or from the perspective of their allies' interests.
Ahmed, and then I want to draw in Kristin on this point. You told us a little bit about how the regional competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran manifests itself in the conflict, but what are the repercussions on the surrounding countries? I mean, there's a war in Yemen. How does that affect Saudi Arabia? How does that affect, the region? Is there a sort of, a back and forth in the reaction, in the interaction?
Yeah, I think this is one of the key implications of the conflict today in Yemen. At the first 2 years of the conflict, all the battles were inside Yemen, and Saudi Arabia, as well as other surrounding countries, were far relatively from any kind of consequences. But later on, we found, the Houthis gaining a lot of weapons, including missiles and drones, which were used later on against Saudi Arabia. And today, Saudi Arabia is suffering a lot, especially the Saudi communities who are in the southern borders of the kingdom. And I think by time pass, we will face even more and more implications coming from Yemen. So why we are saying that? Because the conflict in Yemen, if it's not resolved today, it will be harder to resolve it after 1 year, and it will be even harder if we just leave it without any sort of resolution. That's why it's important to have a serious, attitudes or serious position from the international communities as well as from the regional actors to resolve this kind of conflict before it expands to the surrounding region.
Kristin, we saw the UAE step back from the conflict in Yemen. Is Saudi Arabia on its own? Is it stuck? What are its options, and what is it still trying to achieve, if anything, other than finding an exit?
Well, I think Ahmed said it right. I mean, for Saudi Arabia, I think there's been increasingly grave consequences of the intervention in Yemen, both in its security inside of Saudi Arabia. And we could even just point to this week, I mean, with attacks on tankers or kind of sabotage of tankers on the Red Sea, the port of Jeddah just this past week. So I think, Saudi Arabia has that problem. The other issue, of course, we haven't mentioned the coronavirus pandemic, but real economic challenges that I think make Saudi Arabia really want to turn more to that important transition that they're doing inside of the country. So I think both of these are driving Saudi Arabia to try to find a way out of the Yemen conflict. And we've seen that with Khalid bin Salman, the brother of Mohammed bin Salman, kind of engaging in more kind of higher level negotiations. But, at this point, Riyadh needs security assurances against these kinds of attacks that are happening in the Red Sea and, of course, along its border. And I think that's why we've seen Saudi Arabia signal more recently that they'd accept kind of a UN proposed ceasefire if they can get a buffer zone along the border, kind of making these options to try to move forward and get out of the conflict. But of course, as you alluded to, Kim, they have at the same time to wrestle with all of these different interests within the region, from the separatists in the south, to try to get one kind of unified camp that will help them to do that.
How much daylight is there today between Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis and the UAE? A few years ago, it felt like they were best buddies and saw eye to eye, and Mohammed bin Salman was the protege of Mohammed bin Zayed. It doesn't look like that anymore so much. And so how does that affect both of their foreign policy and how they pursue their interests in the region today? And then I want to talk a little bit about the agreements with Israel and draw in Aaron as well.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I mean, when you look, especially at the UAE, I think they definitely have seen Saudi Arabia, and you could point to Egypt as well, as these key Arab partners that have allowed them to kind of pursue their broader interests in the region. But I think, as the difficulties have arisen in both in Yemen, and we could talk about with Iran as well, and especially I think as these two countries prepare for now this transition in leadership in the United States, where that tight embrace that the Trump administration had of these governments, and particularly of Saudi Arabia, may play against them with a new government that saw those relations being too partisan in partisan terms, and may even seek to punish Saudi Arabia. So I think because of that, we've seen a little bit of distancing. For the first time, we can see some daylight on some key issues. Of course, the UAE kind of pursuing its other interests or different kinds of interests within Yemen. We talked about them getting out and leaving kind of their interests to be held by the Southern Transitional Council. We could talk about recent disputes that have happened even within OPEC over oil policy, which showed some differences. And of course, most recently, the discussion about perhaps pulling back from the boycott or the confrontation that they've had with Qatar, or perhaps some disagreements on how far they really want to, push that confrontation, or if it's in their interest to try to pull back from that. So I think, in this period of transition of the U.S. transition, we're starting to see a little bit more daylight, I think, in their two postures.
And also we're seeing, of course, these peace agreements or normalization agreements, the Abraham Accords between the UAE and Israel, and Bahrain and Israel. And I'm wondering, Kristin, and then Aaron, I'll come to you. I'm wondering, Kristin, there's been a lot of noise about the possibility that Saudi Arabia might be next. And to me, it sounds still quite far in the distance, but there are definite noises. And we've seen these reports about a meeting between Benjamin Netanyahu and Mohammed bin Salman, not confirmed, unconfirmed, but it did happen, didn't happen. There was a jet, there was not a jet. They met in Neom. Is it, because you speak about this pressure that Saudi Arabia is going to face from the Biden administration and Congress, there is a lot of discontent in Washington about Saudi Arabia. Might they be able to signal their willingness continuously about a deal with Israel as a way of diffusing some of that tension or that pressure?
Well, I think, when we look at the Abraham Accords, which has really been led by the UAE, I don't really see it in terms of pressure. I think this was really a strategic decision by the UAE. When they look out on this region, which we're kind of describing, with a lot of different competition with Iran, also with Turkey. And as the UAE has looked to kind of expand its influence, as I mentioned before, even in the Red Sea and in the Mediterranean, I think they came to see Israel as a really potential partner.
Absolutely, but I meant whether Saudi Arabia might sort of dangle the prospect of coming to the table as well with Israel as a way of easing the pressure it's going to face in Washington under a Biden administration.
Well, I think Saudi Arabia, likewise, under this new leadership, is kind of trying to reposition itself, and they're also looking at the same interests in the region, right? So they're also looking towards the Red Sea. So I think strategically, in some ways, the Saudi Arabia can see the benefits of a closer tie to Israel. But I think, they have a very different domestic situation that they have to kind of calculate, as well as the old character of their leadership in the region, which is much more tied to a sort of Islamic or Arab leadership, where I think the UAE has a lot more flexibility in that. So I think there was a lot of interest in doing that with the Trump administration that was applying a lot of pressure. I think there'll be less pressure actually under a Biden administration. And while Saudi Arabia may want to, they may hold that as one card that they can play, to some extent, there'll be a little bit less pressure on them than they had under the Trump administration. So I'm not sure necessarily that they'll move in that direction immediately. I think that's something that's definitely going to need some time, and probably a generational shift from the king to the crown prince.
Aaron, how does Israeli domestic politics these days affect Israel's regional policy, and how much more secure does Israel feel today after the Abraham Accords? And then Karim and Sinan, I want to come to you to discuss, the implications of these accords and what it means for Iran and the, how things play out with Turkey.
Henry Kissinger once famously said that Israel had no foreign policy, only domestic politics. And he reached that conclusion based on trying to negotiate 3 disengagement accords with the Israelis between 1973 and 1975. It's obviously an intriguing statement. It's an exaggeration, but I think if it were to apply, it would apply now to the current Prime Minister of Israel, whose main objective is to secure his own political future and his freedom in an effort to somehow defer, undermine, or seek some sort of immunity from the 3 charges, bribery, breach of trust, and fraud, that he now faces. He will not be the first Israeli prime minister indicted. He'll be the first sitting Israeli prime minister to be indicted. And we should remind ourselves that Ehud Olmert actually went to prison for 16 months. There's precedent here. So Netanyahu's goal, which is why you've had 3 elections in a year and a half, and we may be on the cusp of a 4th. If by December 23rd, there's no budget, the Knesset will automatically dissolve. So Netanyahu's goal is to put together a narrow-based right-wing government and secure a deferral immunity if he could get it. There are also some indications that he wants to run for the presidency of the country, which would give him immunity. So I think that the last 3 or 4 years, as we've built up toward the Abraham Accords, and as the Trump administration has showered him preternaturally with, a set of gifts, some are substantive, some are less so, that has helped. It's helped buoy his indispensability and his survivability. And I think it's validated for him and for many of his supporters what you could honestly call the Netanyahu doctrine, which is we can actually negotiate peace accords with Arab states without compromising or sacrificing much. And if you look at the Netanyahu years, it's stunning to me. All of the conventional wisdom that Israel's treatment and regard for the Palestinians would somehow turn the state of Israel into a pariah has essentially been turned on its head. Israel now has more recognition, more diplomatic contacts with the world than at any point since independence in Latin America, in Asia, with India. And now in the great betrayal, the ultimate betrayal, the region is coming to him. And Kristin is right in the sense that the Emiratis perceive the Israelis, as they fear U.S. retrenchment from the region, as a prospective partner. Mm-hmm. So all of this has helped him. I do not believe it will save him, frankly. In the evidentiary portion of his trial begins in February. But it has helped. It's helped him keep numerous balls in the air. And it looks to me, in the wake of Morocco, there may be an Asian normalizer coming before the end of the Trump administration. The Saudis are a different matter. It's a huge deal if that were to happen, for the reasons that Kristin pointed out. But the Saudis may also want something bigger for it.
Yes, they've already made noises about the fact that they would only do this if it was part of something more regional that involved certainly the Palestinians and direct Palestinian-Israeli talks. But Karim, I want to come to you on these Abraham Accords and get the Iranian perspective and this sort of alliance building against Iran, essentially, with Israel, the UAE, because that's also what this is about. The strategic interests of the UAE and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia are aligning much more with Israel today. So how does Iran feel about this, and how does that impact its regional policies and strategies?
So let me talk about how the Abraham Accords are in one way an asset for Iran, and one way a liability, and perhaps what is the big takeaway? So how is it an asset for Iran that Gulf countries are signing normalization deals with Israel and other countries like Morocco? Well, for the Iranian Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, what's most important is to be the leader of the resistance against the United States, against Israel. So to the extent that he can differentiate himself from Arab neighbors, he'd always called them Zionists or American lackeys in the past, and this simply adds more fodder to his argument. And his belief is that the Arab street, the average person in the Middle East, is far closer to his worldview of resistance against America and Israel than the Gulf and other worldview that we need to normalize. So I think in that sense, he perhaps is happy about it. It's an asset. Now, in what ways is it a liability? In the last 2 decades, Iran has been using Dubai, for example, as its Hong Kong. A lot of its illicit activity has gone through the UAE. Given the economic isolation of Iran, that's where Iran has been doing a lot of different stuff, and its ability to whether it's acquire money and arms or transfer money and arms, it's through those illicit means. So having an Israeli presence in places where it used to feel like it was its backyard, the UAE, or looking at some of its activities in Bahrain is certainly should be a concern for Iran. Now, what is the takeaway for Iran? Because there were some Iranian commentators in the country who essentially blamed themselves, and they said, we Iran, essentially midwife this peace between Arabs and Israelis. We brought these two warring factions together. What does that say about our policies? The reality is, I don't see any indication that the real powers in Iran, the Supreme Leader and the Revolutionary Guards, are now reassessing their long-time regional strategy and policies. So there may be some folks who are starting to question this, but the folks who are actually in charge, I have no indication that these peace deals are forcing them to reconsider how they've conducted business the last 4 decades.
I want to jump quickly to Sinan and Turkey, and how Turkey sees these regional changes, the Abraham Accords. I mean, Turkey had a relationship with Israel. It's had a very difficult relationship under Erdogan, but it had diplomatic ties. How does it see this realignment? And what does Turkey really want? And what can it actually still achieve? Because it's also facing a lot of obstacles and difficulties in asserting itself as a regional player.
Well, let me start with the Abraham Accords. Turkey has been very critical, also because of the tonality of the relationship with Israel, but also in essence because the Turkish President Erdogan, but also the Turkish population generally view these accords as being inimical to the interest of the Palestinians. Having said that, of course, it's also difficult for Turkey to be critical of countries that establish diplomatic relations with Israel, given that Turkey has its own diplomatic relations, and incidentally, it's one of the first countries that recognized the independence of Israel back in '48. So that's the conundrum, the dilemma facing Turkey. But obviously, going forward, what Turkey wants to accomplish is to assert itself as a regional power by also pushing the right buttons in this region, which for the Turkish president means that he should become, and he is, become vocal about the victimization of the Muslim population in this region, appearing to be the champion of the Palestinian cause. And therefore becoming growing in terms of popularity across the region. And when you look at the polls, the Arab Barometer poll and so on, in many of the countries, Turkey indeed has, a large degree of popularity based on these policies. So ultimately, Turkey is driving towards this goal of becoming, a regional power. But with, of course, this is giving rise also to a number of difficulties. So very briefly, it's really this rise, perhaps we can summarize it as whether the Turkish leadership will be able to manage the peaceful rise of Turkey in a way that it does not trigger anti-Turkey coalitions in the region and even more broadly. Today, the answer to that question seems to be a no, that this rise in power has actually triggered anti-Turkey coalitions. But there may be a different world where Turkey could revisit some of its policies, and perhaps this inevitable, what I believe to be the inevitable rise to power of this country, could be done in a more
and indeed, I mean, we're
consensual
seeing,
framework.
of course, already countries like the UAE very busy countering Turkey's agenda in the region. But I want to move on to the incoming Biden administration, what it's inheriting, and what are some of the options that it's going to have. And stay with you, Sinan. You talked about all the honey that Erdogan got from President Trump. It's not all going to be vinegar from President Biden, as you said. But what are the options there for Erdogan and Biden? Is it going to be possible to have a reset? I mean, Biden's had some tough words about Erdogan as a candidate.
Yeah, true, but I think both leaders are interested in a reset. Having said that, it's going to be an enormously difficult task because there are a number of legacy issues which will inevitably become problematic for the relationship. We've seen one, last Monday, the Ghattas sanctions, and I just want to underline that this is the first time that we are seeing, U.S. sanctioning a NATO ally. So we have Ghattas sanctions. Down the road, we have the case of Halkbank, which is, on alleged violations of Iran sanctions in the past. So we have these two, big issues, and then on top of that, we have a number of mutual grievances that still remain unaddressed. Turkey has problems with U.S. behavior. U.S. has problems with Turkish behavior. So that's the baggage that will face both Erdogan and the incoming administration.
And
now,
where can Turkey help? Can Turkey help on Syria, for example? What can it offer the Biden administration?
Yeah, that's basically what I wanted to say as well. That despite this baggage, there is still quite a considerable room to actually have a convergence of views and establish a mutually beneficial collaborative relationship, because Turkey could indeed help on many of these issues, whether it is the rebalancing towards Iran. Turkey has always supported a diplomatic solution. That's one part. Secondly, Turkey being firmly anchored in NATO would also help the US position on Russia. So there are a number of regional, conflict areas where Turkey's repositioning towards a common set of objectives would also help to advance the US interest in this region.
Kristin, similar question to you. What can the UAE, or rather, let's stay with Saudi Arabia. What can Saudi Arabia offer or do to help ease the transition and the relationship with the Biden administration? And separately to both Kristin and Aaron, do you think that there might be, in the last days of the Trump administration, a Israeli strike against Iran, this alignment of interests or more covert operations against Iran just before the Biden administration comes in? But Kristin, first on on Saudi Arabia and what it can do to ease this incoming relationship with the Biden administration?
Well, I think they're going to have a bit of a difficult time, which is why, I mean, I sense a little bit more incoherence in Saudi policy right now. They're sort of reaching out a little bit even to Turkey with King Salman agreeing to meet with Turkey, easing a bit up on Qatar perhaps, not exactly having their footing. And I think it's because there has been a lot of anger built up, and again, it's a partisan issue amongst Democrats in Congress. But even there's somewhat of a bipartisan coalition that wants to see the U.S. Take a tougher line on Saudi Arabia. I mean, I think from the Democrats, even a punitive line, but a line that basically sends a different signal to, the young leader, Mohammed bin Salman, about what's acceptable and what's not in the region. So we see Saudi Arabia, I think, kind of pre-setting up things before the Biden administration comes. Showing some willingness, meeting with Netanyahu, maybe some flexibility there, easing up a bit on the Qatar issue, having discussions there. At the same time, though, going even further and pushing through the prosecution of both the American Al-Fatahi doctor recently, as well as moving the women as like Ülgen Al-Hathloul, the women activist, to another court, the Special Terrorism Court, and putting, addressing those charges differently. It's kind of sending a signal that they want their domestic politics off line. Like it's not something that they want to discuss. But I think, they will have some challenges in making this transition. And of course, that's before we even talk about the main policy, which is going to be the main one that they're concerned about, is the big shift that we are expecting to see in the Biden administration towards Iran.
Karim, do you want to quickly give us your take on the shift that we expect under a Biden administration to re-engage, and then I'll come back to the question to Aaron. But let's stay on Iran, because we do expect a big shift under the Biden administration. So let's parse this in two parts. First, what do you think we should expect? Is it going to be just re-engagement? Is it going to be re-entering the nuclear deal, no preconditions? Is it going to be something broader with preconditions? But separately, what do you think the Biden administration should do, knowing what the mistakes of the Obama administrations have been?
Thanks, Kim. So I think President-elect Biden has been very clear in saying that the United States would return to the nuclear deal if Iran were to return to the deal. The question is whether the enormous mistrust between the two sides will be able to be bridged, which would allow a full return to the deal, or is perhaps a partial return to the deal more likely, whereby the United States removes certain sanctions in exchange for Iran reversing some elements of its nuclear program. That remains to be seen. I think the recent assassination of the Iranian nuclear scientist and Revolutionary Guardsman, Mr. Fakhrizadeh, complicates matters, because on one hand, Iran's economy is under enormous strain to restore its economy. It actually needs to go back to the nuclear deal, but if it wants to restore deterrence, national pride, and avenge the death of its scientists, that could sabotage the likelihood of revival of the JCPOA. My view, and I think it's something which it was an important lesson learned during the Obama years, and it kind of alludes, Kim, to something that you were getting at earlier, which is during the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear negotiations under President Obama, I believe there was a hope that certain members of the Obama team had, and it wasn't necessarily wrong-headed, but it was a hope that if we resolve this nuclear issue with Iran, if we can reach a cooperation, an accommodation on the nuclear file, we can apply that goodwill in order to cooperate on regional issues like Syria. And I think what the Obama experience proved is that Iran can walk and chew gum at the same time, meaning there was an important reason why Iran agreed to the nuclear compromise in exchange for economic relief, in exchange for sanctions relief, but it didn't alter one iota its regional practices, or frankly, its domestic practices and its taking of American hostages, etc. So I do think one important takeaway for the Biden administration, learning the lesson from the Obama administration, is that you can simultaneously talk to Iran about a revival of the nuclear deal while also being very sober and clear-eyed about what Iran is doing in the region and trying to think up ways to partner with regional partners and allies to counter and contain that. And after the most recent execution, which took place very recently, just in the last few days in Iran, of the social media activist Ruhollah Zam, who was essentially kidnapped in Iraq, taken back to Iran, and then executed. You saw strong statements of condemnation from Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken. So I think that the Biden administration realizes that we can condemn Iran's domestic practices, contain and counter them in the region, while simultaneously talking to the regime about a potential full or partial return to the JCPOA.
Karim, is there an argument to be made for looking at this nuclear deal that Iran struck and the concessions it made, and say that in the end it gave concessions and gave up things that it knew it could deal with, it could handle making those concessions because it was getting so much in return, sanctions relief, and keeping so much that mattered much more, i.e. its regional role. A little bit like when, President Assad withdrew his troops from Lebanon in 2005. He was losing something, but it was basically just sort of releasing some pressure because he knew he was going to be able to keep a lot else that mattered to his real power. Or when he gave up his chemical weapons in 2013, it looked like a big concession, but in the end, it was just a way of relieving some pressure. Is that how we could look at what Iran achieved with the nuclear deal?
Well, I'll tell you what's complicated, Kim, is the fact that about 100% of Iranian trade is with countries other than the United States. So the United States on its very own doesn't have it has certainly leverage over Iran, but a US policy which brings in the Europeans, the Chinese, the Russians, the Asian partners of Iran is far, far more effective. And the reality is that whereas there was a virtual global consensus, including in Moscow, Beijing, and Brussels, all of those countries wanted to avert nuclear-armed Iran. You don't have that same global consensus with regards to Iran's role in the Middle East. We know that Russia has actually partnered with Iran in Syria. The Chinese see Iran as an important energy partner, and they want to try to remain neutral. I think the Europeans are sometimes confused as to whether Iran is a stabilizing or destabilizing role. And I think this will be one of the challenges and responsibilities for the Biden administration, that same global unity which we marshaled in order to reach the JCPOA. I do think that we're going to have to make the case not only obviously to regional partners like Israel and the Gulf countries who already very much agree obviously about Iran's problematic regional role, but how are you going to make the case to China, Russia, Europe, that listen, what Iran is doing in Syria, in Lebanon, and Iraq is bad for global security. In Yemen is bad for global security, and we need to work together to either counter or contain that behavior.
Kristin and Aaron, we just heard Karim lay out what we might see under a Biden administration in terms of re-engaging with Iran. Just very briefly, because I want to go to Ahmed still and then go to the questions from the audience. If you haven't sent your question in, please do. If you're watching us, I'll be looking at them shortly in the comment box. But Kristin and Aaron, very briefly, do you think that in the next, 30 days or so, or just a little bit more, 35 days, we might see more sabotage actions or covert operations, more assassinations of nuclear scientists, as Israel and its new friends in the Gulf try to contain what the room for maneuver that President Biden will have when he comes in, or put more pressure on Iran ahead of such engagement? Kristin, you can go first. You're on mute, Kristin.
Got it. You mentioned before the possibility of maybe Israel undertaking a strike with support from the Gulf states. That would be the most severe, I guess, action. I don't know. I'm really skeptical that the Gulf states would be on board for something that provocative. I think I mentioned the Abqaiq attack before. I think they realize the danger that Iran can pose to them, and they've had some ambivalence, in fact, even towards the Trump maximum pressure strategy, which obviously they were happy to see Iran deprived of resources. But at the same time, they were the ones taking the hit when Iran was acting out. So I think, we've kind of seen where the Gulf states are moving right now. Just recently, they met in Manama for the Manama dialogues, and they're doing a very unified and making an argument that they need to be included and at the table this time, unlike under the Obama administration. And trying to make the pitch that the Biden administration should not move straight to a return to the JCPOA, but should take their interests and looking at missiles proliferation and these broader regional issues, use the leverage that the Trump administration has granted them to address those issues simultaneously. So I think that's really where their heads are right now.
And Aaron, what do you think we might see from the actions that Israel does admit are its own, in terms of strikes of Iranian assets in Syria, more assassinations of scientists or other covert types of operation? I mean, maybe not necessarily an actual big strike, but more covert actions.
One of the reasons that Benjamin Netanyahu was the longest governing prime minister in the history of the state of Israel, even surpassing Israel's greatest prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, is because he's inherently risk averse. And this risk aversion, it seems to me, has created, he talks very tough and has acted on occasion, but he's avoided the kind of kinetic actions of some of his predecessors. I would be stunned, frankly. I would not be stunned by additional cyber or perhaps additional hits on, certainly in Syria, the Israelis have operated freely, launching more than 500 strikes against various targets. I think you conceivably could see that, but I would be stunned if you saw anything more dramatic, which would not just create a constraint for the Biden administration. It would be a strike on Iran would be regarded as a perfidious action by Israel, even before a new administration preoccupied with domestic issues has come in without pretext. And I mean a serious pretext. I find that to be highly unlikely.
I think a lot of people watching us in the Middle East will be very reassured by these words, because the rumors, the anxiety about what might happen before a Biden administration takes over, really is on people's mind, including in capitals like Beirut. So those will be reassuring words. I want to go to Ahmed and ask you what your advice would be to the Biden administration about how to help bring a solution to the conflict in Yemen. And is it the most complicated issue? Is it one of the most complicated issues on President Biden's in tray, or is it one of the, let's say, low-hanging fruit where you could show progress, solution, and potentially make it an entry point into dealing with these other very difficult regional dynamics and the Saudi-Iran rivalry? Ahmed.
Yeah, I think, speaking about the US influence over the regional actors and how they can do or how they can push that towards peace in Yemen, I think it's something essential and something important to take into consideration. We have seen that during the Stockholm Agreement or Stockholm consultations, when the US put some pressure on Saudi Arabia, they could bring out the Stockholm Agreement, and if they do the same, they can. They can also do some positive contribution to the peace in the country. But still, the missing part in Yemen today is how they can put the same pressure on the Iranians, because on the other side of the country we have the Iranian-backed Houthis, who seems to be like a non-state actor and have no, there is no guarantee to control. So this is the key problem. President-elect Biden in May 2019 said that he would end any support to Saudi Arabia, but this is, not enough. I think
Saudi-led war in Yemen,
this
not overall support, right?
Yeah, exactly. This is, one of the key points. But ending the support is not enough, and it's not just necessary to end the conflict in the country, because today, as I mentioned at the beginning, the conflict in Yemen is not just between Saudi Arabia and some parts inside Yemen. It became larger, and it's like a kind of fragmented conflict, which need like a sort of comprehensive approach to tackle it. Yeah.
Kristin, do you think that there is an opening there in Yemen, not only to help bring peace, but as the Biden administration looks at the region, where can it start to get success? Where can it have a good opening? Because with Iran, it's going to be much more difficult, much more complicated, much longer. Is Yemen one of those entry points where it's a conflict that's lasted for too long, taken too big a toll on the people of this country, and is actually potentially more easily solvable than, say, Syria?
I agree with Ahmed, where I think actually, for sure, I think the Biden administration will be looking towards Yemen. I think Congress had already been signaling the desire to push Saudi Arabia on this issue, and I expect them to take that up. But I think Ahmed's exactly right. I think to some degree Saudi Arabia is ready to make a deal if they can, and they've scaled back, what they were hoping to get out of this. If they can just get out with, some security assurances, I think they will find a more willing partner in Saudi Arabia. The problem is exactly as Ahmed mentioned. How do you get the Houthis to the table, especially when they seem to be having the upper hand and gaining at this point? And we could look at what's going on around Marib and some of these other places. So I think then what it means is that the Yemen conflict might end up having to be tied in with what the Biden administration is doing with Iran. And kind of because they're going to need, all of the levers that they can find to try to bring some resolution there. But I think to your more general point, there is some opportunity now, I think, across the region for the Biden administration, if they're willing to commit, their kind of diplomatic energies and leverage to try to pull back. I think the maximalist techniques of the Trump administration have kind of, and a lot of these different, and also just the actions of a lot of these different conflicting parties and a lot of these confrontations, whether we look at Libya or Yemen, Qatar, have sort of reached a point of diminishing returns. So there's definitely some room to step in on these different issues, especially as I mentioned before. I think with the coronavirus pandemic and the economic challenges, a lot of these states need to start shifting a bit more of their interests internally and addressing these really big challenges at home.
Absolutely. I'm going to go to some of the questions from the audience, and there are a couple of questions on Turkey for Sinan. One of the questions is about whether the tensions will continue between Turkey and the UAE on Libya and beyond, with the sale of the F-35s to the Emiratis. That's also addressed to you, Kristin. The question comes from Koji. Sinan, let's start with you first. Do you think the tension will continue between Turkey and the UAE on the issue of Libya?
Yes, I think not just on Libya, but in general, the tensions are due to continue, and there are a couple of underlying reasons. One, the animosity between the leadership has become somewhat personal. That is, I think, one factor that we need to underline. Secondly, the two countries have very different outlooks regarding the future of the region. With Turkey supporting groups that are seen as being a major threat to the stability of the regime in the UAE. And also a third factor is the regional set of regional alliances, where we see a very close partnership between between France and the UAE that is at odds with what Turkey is trying to achieve in the region. And therefore, the combination of all these factors do have a bearing for the future of this relationship. One, perhaps, dynamic that can change this is that if there is a settlement in the GCC, that includes obviously a new opening towards Qatar. That might start to change things because one of these, the element is Turkey's strong support to Qatar, and at least that perhaps that problematic relationship from the standpoint of the UAE might then be overcome if there is an agreement within the GCC.
Kristin, I want to come to you with a question. Actually, I'm going to move on to that because we've got a few questions coming in and we've got about 15 minutes left in our session. There's a question from Mohammed Mujtaba about the UAE and its renewed efforts to engage President Assad. And that also actually goes to the question about Turkey and the tension between the UAE and Turkey, because one of the ways of putting pressure on Turkey or pushing against Turkey is by re-engaging Assad and bringing him into the Arab fold, as the Emiratis seem to be thinking that they could do. How does that play out? What do you think the Emiratis are trying to do, and how will Iran see that? Is it actually possible, or is it the Holy Grail, trying to peel Bashar al-Assad away from the Iranians?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the competition with Turkey, but I think this is a case where for the UAE, they just had a different vision on this from the beginning towards Syria. I mean, I think their interests or their stance towards the Syrian conflict was very different from what you saw with definitely a Qatar, but also even a Saudi Arabia from the beginning of the conflict. And I think it has to go to that more ideological posturing. Well, it's geostrategic too, but also the ideological posturing and these intra-Sunni issues where they just saw that as being grounds for much more polarization and generation of extremism. Where they were wanting to see the region go more in the direction of national interests and pursuit of national interests, which is where you can see them being willing to work with Israel, which is totally fine with that kind of posture as well. And so I think to that extent, then they saw that basically some kind of dealing with Bashar al-Assad would be necessary to achieve that shift in the region. And you could also talk about their deepening relations with Russia as well, and the partnership there, which puts them on a different stance, I'd say, for sure, than Turkey when looking at Syria.
Karim, picking up on this point about the efforts by the UAE to engage President Assad, and as I heard from Emirati officials, trying to re-engage with Assad as the Arab world and potentially the Arab League to at least have a say and a conversation with President Assad. Is that a fool's errand when it comes to the idea that you could peel President Assad away from Tehran? It's a long-standing relationship.
You know, Kim, there's that famous Einstein quote that insanity is trying the same thing over and over and expecting different results. Indeed, there has been long efforts to try to instigate a divorce between the Assad regime and the Islamic Republic of Iran. And we weren't able to do that when the relationship was, far less cozy than it is after a decade of Iran essentially being Assad's financial and military lifeline. Really, Assad owes his life to the Islamic Republic of Iran. So I'm personally skeptical that efforts to try to create a distance between Damascus and Tehran will be successful. But, you know, I'm always reminded of something that Bill Burns wrote in his, when he was leaving the State Department, reflecting on 3 decades at the State Department, which was, don't just admire the problem, you know, also think about what are constructive ways to address it. And so, you know, to the extent we can attempt to create fissures between Iran and Damascus using perhaps Russia's help, that's fine. But if it's at the cost of essentially legitimizing Bashar Assad, for me, that would not be worth the gamble. And I would agree with the words you use, which is that it would be a fool's
Iran,
errand.
there's a question from Ethan Pankhurst about Hezbollah's role in Lebanon. And Karim, whether you expect that this role will increase, or is it possible for a new political reality? I mean, I think a lot of this is tied to the regional context and to what and how the Biden administration will engage with Iran. So what do you see in the future for Hezbollah's role in Lebanon?
I actually don't see Iran's role and Hezbollah's role in Lebanon so much tied to the Biden administration, in that we've had 40 years of continuity there. And various administrations have tried different strategies to contain, counter Iran. They've oftentimes had the opposite effect, the Iraq War being the best example of that. You know, my view, Kim, and we've talked about this before, is that in the past, both the United States and our regional partners have aspired for these 10 out of 10 solutions, which is get Iran out of Syria, get Iran out of Lebanon, get Iran to stop supporting Hezbollah. And we've gotten 0 out of 10. And so I think we need to think in a much more granular way about what would be a 5 out of 10 approach to countering Iran in the Middle East. And, you know, the 3 words that I use are limit, interdict, and expose Iranian activities. And I think it requires a lot of cooperation between not only, obviously, you know, the U.S. government and regional governments, but very specifically, you know, ministries of defense, intelligence, who have a much better idea than certainly, you know, I do or people on the outside do about how specifically does Iran finance and arm the Houthis, Hezbollah, Assad, the Hashd al-Shab? How can we expose, interdict, and limit those activities? I don't know if we've ever had a concerted approach towards that.
Those are some very good points, Karim. Thank you very much. I want to read a couple of comments that have come in from a viewer called Muhammad Nasif. They're not questions, but I think they're quite lovely comments, so I would like to read them. He's quite hopeful. He thinks President Biden will press to stop the wars in the Middle East. We should all cooperate for peace and prosperity for all, and we all have common enemies, and they are poverty and ignorance. And I think, you know, if we could all bring that kind of hope to our discussions about foreign policy and the Middle East, that would be really quite wonderful. Unfortunately, the reality is a little bit darker, but we're all hopeful that, you know, in some ways, as we say sometimes, you know, it is the darkest night before dawn. It has been very difficult in the region, but there must be solutions out there with creative thinking the way that Ahmed laid out and all of you and Karim just now. I want to start wrapping up by asking you all to answer the same question, something that is a favorite topic I know of Aaron, but I want to ask it to all of you, and I'll start with Aaron, and then you can all have a few moments to think about your answer. Does the Middle East still matter to America? And if yes, why? And if not, why not? If you can each take just a couple of minutes to tell us what you think, and how that would, how therefore the Biden administration should look at the Middle East. And Aaron, because you've talked about this a lot before, I'll start with you and give us your view on whether the Middle East still matters, and why. If you could just unmute your microphone, Aaron, thank you.
The Middle East does matter, just not as much, I would argue to you, as it used to. And I would have said that even if the president-elect was not facing the greatest set of domestic crises of any American president since Franklin Roosevelt. I could identify 5 intersecting crises that predated, including COVID, but the others predated Mr. Trump, although he has clearly exacerbated and made them worse. It is American security and prosperity that this administration will focus on. It is American security and prosperity that this administration will be judged by, which means that since government is about choosing, the administration is going to have to be very careful how it operates in a region that is increasingly broken, in my judgment, and dysfunctional. I mean, Iraq and Afghanistan, the 2 longest wars in American history, has created a risk aversion on the part of 3 administrations. America is weaning itself off of Arab hydrocarbons, even though the rest of the world depends on them. So we will have a continuing and abiding interest there. There are changing priorities. It's extraordinarily, we spent $60 billion easy in Iraq and Afghanistan trying to cope with the threat of Sunni jihadi terror in the wake of 9/11. And yet, when the real threat to the Republic came, it didn't come with Sunni jihadis, Al-Qaeda, the derivatives of the Islamic State. It came from a virus, which has done more damage to this Republic than any conceivable act of terror. So, yes, the Middle East matters. Mr. Biden will get drawn in at some point, I'm absolutely certain. But I think we need to begin to understand that there are a variety of other issues that may be more central, frankly, China, pandemic, climate, more integral to the health and well-being of the United States than what we do in this region.
Those are very good points, Aaron, thank you. And they tie in with a question that's come in from one of the viewers who wanted to know very specifically, on what date do you think that President Biden can start paying attention and engage with the region while his domestic priorities are at home? I don't think any of us have the answer. If we listen to Karim, the U.S.
February
able
14th.
to and walk at the same time. So it should be able to deploy its Secretary of State and some of the brains at the National Security Council to look at the Middle East. Ahmed, I want to go to you next. And with that question, does the Middle East still matter to America? Should Yemen matter, and why?
Yes, I think it does matter because the U.S. cannot disconnect itself from this important region, especially where you have this kind of international actors are coming to the area and they have so much influence. So I think the U.S. will be there, and even it will extend its influence in the area.
Kristin, over to you, and perhaps you can tell us a little bit about, yes, the Middle East matters, but it matters differently as Aaron just said, and it requires perhaps less involvement and more work with partners like the UAE?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, if we've now had two administrations as different as they are, the Obama administration and the Trump administration, both really send indicators that they're more interested in burden sharing and in ultimately pivoting more to Asia, where they see China as being the big strategic challenge for the United States. That does mean that they need to approach the region differently. And I think that's why if we look at the Biden administration coming in, they're kind of signaling the two big issues for them will be, one, the nuclear re-engagement, which they see again as a big, more underlying security threat that could threaten their overall posture globally because of the whole problem of nuclear proliferation. And then this kind of idea of doing something punitive or rethinking our relationship with Saudi Arabia, which exactly addresses this issue of how do you deal with these partners. And so I think even as the United States looks to maybe burden share, shift and pivot, they're going to have to be dealing with these same partners. And I think, the UAE in particular is setting itself up as being like the indispensable player in the region, that they're going to have to be, they're kind of everywhere, and they're going to have to be, called upon to resolve any of these different issues. And, I think the relationship with Saudi Arabia and how it changes will also speak to that as well.
Thank you, Kristin. Karim, over to you with the same question. The viewpoint from Iran would be very different, of course. Does the Middle East still matter? Should the US still be involved? And it ties in with a question we just got from a viewer, Parth Kelkar, who says, after all the things that international players have tried to do and failed to achieve, can we not let things just play out in the Middle East on their own? I would think that that's a perspective that Iran would quite like.
So first, let me say I agree with Aaron very much that the greatest threats facing the United States are internal, not external, not related to the Middle East. Tony Blinken, who's going to be Secretary of State, has a common phrase which he uses, which the world doesn't organize itself. And I think similarly, you could make the argument that Middle East conflicts don't resolve themselves. And I'm skeptical, but that countries like China or Russia are going to step up to the plate. So by default, I think it will be
the plate. We've seen the consequences of Russian involvement in Syria.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I just say a couple of things about why, as you said, Kim, the Middle East matters, but perhaps matters differently. Number one is that we're facing the greatest refugee crisis since World War II, which really shows no signs of abating. And that could have, and it is having, a profound effect on the existence of the European Union. And so I think that simply allowing those refugees to bleed out of the region is going to have enormous consequences for our partners and allies in Europe. The second point I'd make is that if you look over the last, let's say, 4.5 decades at radicalism in the Middle East, well, 4 or 5 decades ago, what was the most radical group in the region was the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And a decade later came
also as well, yeah.
I'm sorry?
No, sorry, go ahead.
So a decade after the PLO comes Hezbollah, and we say, well, that's really bad. And a decade after that comes Al-Qaeda, and we say, well, that's awful, even worse than Hezbollah. A decade after Al-Qaeda comes ISIS. And the trend lines, in my view, are not looking good. If we look at the last 4 or 5 decades as precedent, I don't necessarily believe we've reached the nadir with ISIS. And when I ask folks who think about these issues, at military outposts in the U.S., what is your concern now that ISIS has presumably been defeated? Well, what comes next? They're very concerned about groups like ISIS that now have, in the future, potentially have access to biological weapons, to 3D technology where they can print WMD. And as all of you who are living in the region know, we now have 1 or 2 generations of kids who have just been languishing in refugee camps with nothing to lose. So I think Aaron is right that the Middle East is not as integral to U.S. Economic and security issues as before, but it's going to come with a different set of challenges, as you alluded to, Kim.
Thank you, Karim. We're going to wrap up by giving Sinan the last word. I do want to inject a little bit of hope in this conversation. Karim, I know things look dire and there's always a worse group that arises, but I'm also very heartened by what I see around me in the region, in Lebanon, in Iraq, and elsewhere, by the younger generations that are really pushing hard for change, sometimes paying for it by ending up in prison. But when you see how they're protesting and how they're pushing for elections and winning elections, for example, on university campuses, setting themselves apart from sectarian politics and the establishment, I do think we must give them credit and look at them as the hope for the future. Sinan, you have the last word. If you can, keep it brief. I know it's a little bit unfair, but do give us your 30 seconds on why the wider region continues to matter or not for the US.
Well, I will somewhat evade that question, given that that's been already very eloquently answered by some of the other speakers, and I'll just tell you why I think Turkey matters to the US as part. The first reason is, of course, Turkey has a large footprint, so it's not just about this region, it's also about Russia, it's also about NATO, it's also about Balkans and East Med. But more importantly, when we look at the priorities of the Biden administration in foreign policy, perhaps with the exception of China, Turkey ticks all the other boxes, whether it's about strengthening the transatlantic bond, whether it's about containing Russia, whether it's about, having a new deal with Iran. Turkey has to be there, has to be part of that. And with a Turkey that is a more cooperative player, the US, these US goals will be more easily achieved. And perhaps a final word, even on this somewhat perhaps now, half-baked idea of the project of democracies, the Conference of Democracies, if that's going to have an impact, it's going to have an impact in a country like Turkey, not Sweden.
Sinan, that's a great point to end on. Turkey ticks all the boxes. Erdogan has a lot of work ahead of him. This brings us to the end of this panel. Thank you very much to all our excellent speakers. Ahmed Nagi from the Carnegie Center in Beirut, Kristin Diwan in Washington, Aaron David Miller, Sinan Ülgen, and Karim Sadjadpour. Thank you all for your excellent insights, and thank you to all those of you who tuned in. The next panel from the Carnegie Middle East Center's yearly conference begins at 7:30 in Beirut, 7:30 Beirut time, so that's in just under half an hour, 12:30 p.m. Eastern time, and it will be tackling the issue of international actors in the emerging Middle East. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and thank you to our speakers. Good night from Beirut, from me, Ghattas.